Hi, everyone, and welcome to Katie Couric. The midterm elections are upon us and could bring some historic change to Washington. Here for a preview of the big night is Kate Zernike, author of Boiling Mad, Inside Tea Party America. We are also joined by National Review editor Rich Lowry, and in Washington, our CBS News political analyst Jamal Simmons. And as always, we'd like to say a quick thank you to the sponsor of this web show, Dove. All right, let's dig right in because this has been such a fascinating political cycle. And Kate, let me start with you. You've been steeping in tea for some time. Tell me why you wanted to write a book about the Tea Party movement and how your experience writing this book changed your perceptions of the movement itself.
Well, I think like a lot of people, I had sort of heard, I came back, I was actually on leave at the New York Times where I work until November of 2009. And so I had sort of seen it and read about it from a distance and kind of had some of the perceptions that a lot of people did just seeing it on TV or just watching the rallies or looking at the signs. And I found that when I came back and I started talking to people in the Tea Party movement, so many things they said surprised me. And when I met, for instance, Kelly Carrinder, who I identify in the book as the first Tea Partier, was everything she said to me, I kept saying, really? Really? And she would say something else, and I was like, really? Tell me more. It was just sort of everything. You couldn't sort of fit it in the neat boxes that I think people were trying to draw up for it. And I think there was, there was a lot of polemicizing about the Tea Party movement, and I wanted to write a book that would explain to people who maybe didn't know how they felt about it, that would try to come up through the middle and try to sort of look at it from both sides.
Tell us a little more about this Kelly Carrinder, who you say is really kind of the person who started the whole movement, if you will.
Yeah, a lot of Tea Party leaders will identify her as the first Tea Partier, and she is she's not who I would have expected anyway. She lives in Seattle. She's 29 years old. She's half Mexican. Lives with now her husband. At the time, she was engaged to an Obama voter. She teaches basic math to welfare recipients. She performs with an improv company on weekends. She has a pierced nose, but she reads National Review. She reads a lot of libertarian.
I was waiting for that to come.
I
was about to pounce.
And she's a big fan of libertarian economists, and she just looked at the stimulus and she thought this doesn't make any sense. She does not believe in Keynesian economics, and so she tried to call her senators and found that their voicemail was full, and so her fiance at the time, who's this Obama supporter, was like, I can only hear so much of this. So he said, why don't you start a blog? She starts a blog, and she feels like that doesn't do it for her. So she thinks, I'm going to do a protest. And she says, I live in Seattle, and there are all these protesters against the war and against the World Trade Organization. If they can do it, I can do it better. So she starts a protest, and she alerts some conservative media personalities, and they advertise it for her. And she doesn't get many people, but it sort of energizes her to keep going. And that's kind of how the Tea Party movement grew, with people scattered around, and they maybe do one protest, and then they get excited about doing another, and then some conservative media picks up on it and spreads the word, and it just gradually grew like that.
And Rich, what would you say the Tea Party wants? What is the average Tea Party? Obviously, they're not a monolithic group,
sure.
But if there are some basic tenets you would ascribe to that movement, what would they be?
I think it's very easy to answer. It's a genuinely grassroots movement devoted to reducing government, and it's people who are appalled by what they're seeing out of Washington, both in terms of the substance and in terms of the process. And I think what's happened in this election cycle is very interesting, is that the size of government has become a cultural issue. Kind of the traditional cultural issues have receded a little bit, abortion, gay marriage, all the rest of it. But now people in the Tea Party movement think what we're seeing in Washington, the bailouts, the levels of debt, the spending, are changing the nature of the country fundamentally. And that's why you've seen such a strong reaction to what's happening.
Let me ask you both, and then I'll get Jamal's take on what a lot of skeptics are saying about the Tea Party. Where were you when George W. Bush was president? Obviously, the deficit, he came into office with the budget surplus. The deficit began to get out of control during his administration with the spending on 2 wars and you could say tax cuts for some of the wealthiest Americans. So they might say, gee, there was big government before. Why all of a sudden are you surfacing now?
Part of it is a reaction against the Republican establishment and the Bush administration. You see Karl Rove, in some respects, crosswise with elements of the Tea Party, because these people are brimming with an anti-establishment fervor, and that's why you've seen so many incumbent Republican senators go down in these primaries. So it's a reaction in part against what happened in the Bush years as well.
But I also think, look, the Tea Party supporters generally identify themselves as Republicans, as conservative Republicans. They are supportive of the military. They're not inclined to protest a Republican president and one who's, a lot of the deficit was going into 2 wars. They're not inclined to protest that.
Do they not care about social issues, as Rich was saying?
Well, they are social conservatives, and they would define themselves as social conservatives. What they say is they don't want to talk about those issues. They feel like the Republican Party went astray in spending so much time talking about social issues, debating whether Terry Schiavo should live or die, and lost its focus on economic conservatism.
Jamal, I'm not ignoring you down there in Washington. I want to give you your due face time. But let me get your views on the Tea Party. There's a big discussion. Have they hurt the Republican Party because they've sort of created a chasm within the party itself with more establishment candidates and more extreme candidates, or more fiscally conservative candidates, I guess you would say? Or have they helped the Republican Party by energizing them? In fact, I have an interesting quote that I was going to tell you about, Jamal. One person I interviewed said the Tea Party was aligned with the Republicans, but Republicans aren't necessarily aligned with the Tea Party. So how does this shake out for the party itself? That was a very long question. I'm sorry, Jamal.
It's funny. The more I hear about the Tea Party, the more it sounds very familiar to the way Democrats were thinking about some of the people on the left in the blogger community and online who in 2004, 2005 were very active and upset at the Democratic Party for what they thought were failures. 80% of Tea Party members are Republicans, as the Pew Center has figured out. And I think the question about whether or not they have become they're going to be more helpful than hurtful. We know the places where the Tea Party has become hurtful. You look at some place like Delaware with Christine O'Donnell, and you can see there was a seat there on the table that Republicans should have been able to pick up, and they weren't able to, and that's probably because of the Tea Party. Now, were they going to be helpful? It's unclear yet, and it may actually be true that if the Democrats win in Nevada and in Colorado, where they also face Tea Party candidates, that those may also be places they were hurtful.
What do you think, Rich? I mean, how do you think the Republican Party has reacted to the Tea Party? Are they moving more to the right? It clearly appears that.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, Delaware is clearly a case where I think Jamal's right. That was a seat the Republicans could have won.
Because Mike Castle was expected to win.
But it looks O'Donnell has a very tough road there. On top of everything else, she's just too conservative probably for the state. But on the whole,
too conservative and maybe just a little out there, right?
Well, I'll let you. I don't know whether she's out there, but
well,
she's.
Some of her statements have been a little out there.
She doesn't have a background of someone with a lot of political experience, obviously, except for losing prior races. So she has a tough time there. But in general, the Republican Party was decimated after 06 and 08, a party that was flat on its back, a party that people assumed was dead for going forward, perhaps for a decade or more, and you've seen it revitalized because of the Tea Party. So on the whole, it's been an enormous benefit to the Republican Party. There's been some awkwardness in adjusting to it, as you've seen especially with John Cornyn, the head of the Republican Senate Committee, got caught up in all these primary fights with Tea Party candidates and lost a lot of them, including Delaware. But on the whole, I think the party has adjusted and realized this is a very healthy movement, and should be accommodated.
Having said that, go ahead, Jamal.
Katie, I think one thing that we should keep in mind is look at what's happening in Alaska. I think that's a precursor to what may happen in Washington when a lot of these Tea Party candidates show up, where you have Lisa Murkowski, who was the Republican senator who lost to Joe Miller, a Tea Party candidate in the primary, and now she's waging this write-in campaign. There's going to be I think there's going to be some friction that exists between these establishment Republicans like Mitch McConnell and others who are dealing with this new influx of Tea Party people. And I will say, I think if there's a Republican who hopes to have the national mantle of the presidency, they should go back and look at what Barack Obama did back in 2006, where he actually stood up to some of the people online and when they were coming after Democrats who voted against George Bush's Supreme Court nominees, and he said, you know what, we can't be in the business of opposing people who agree with us 75% of the time because they disagree with us a few other times. Somebody in the Republican Party, who has credibility with the Tea Party, is going to have to sort of stand up and say to the Tea Party people, we want you to be a part of this, but we also need you to play with the rest of us.
Yeah, are there Republicans who agree with some of the tenets of the Tea Party movement, but don't sort of feel comfortable with the way they've been portrayed, at least?
Well, I think you'll see, Jamal's right in this sense. If you get Sharon Angle and Harry Reid and Joe Miller in there in the Republican Senate caucus, as I expect is going to happen with all of them.
You mean Rand Paul?
Sorry, what did I say?
Yeah, you said Harry Reid.
Harry Reid.
That would be a very weird process. Harry's like, I'm not going anywhere.
It's a big tent.
Yeah.
What did I say, Harry? That's a weird, we'll have to.
I don't know.
I'll talk to my therapist about that afterwards. Yeah. But if we get Rand Paul and the others in there, there's going to be, these are purists. They're very committed to doing everything possible to reduce the size of government, and there's going to be tensions with the Senate leadership inevitably. All things considered, I would prefer that to not having those Republican senators, not having Republicans in there who are very serious about reducing government. Not Mitch McConnell's comfort level is not the most important thing to worry about.
But do you think they're actually going to be able to achieve their goals? There's one thing to have protests and express your opinions. It's another thing to actually operate. And there are some rules and requirements in the nation's capital when it comes to getting legislation passed.
Well,
what is going to happen, you think, when if they are in office? Are they going to actually be frustrated? Are their followers going to be frustrated because they can't carry out their edict?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. If you think the size of the debt is a huge threat to the country, and if you think we have a huge problem with politicians who talk about limiting government and limiting the deficit and never do anything about it, these people are going to be part of the solution in the big picture. Now, in terms of, and I think they'll cut the budget if they take the House to 08 levels when it comes to domestic discretionary spending. But will they get that through the Senate? I don't know. Will President Obama sign it? Of course not. So what we're really seeing is the first leg into a much broader fight, which is over the presidency in 2012, and which Republicans are going to have to convince the Tea Party, stay energized, stay engaged, don't think you're going to get everything you want just because you had a good midterm. It's a much longer fight than that.
But also, I think even if you cut discretionary spending, that's not going to take a huge chunk out of the debt. I mean, that's not going to satisfy the Tea Partiers' desire to really reduce the debt. And frankly, the only way to do that
is entitlements.
Social Security, Medicare, and to go after military spending, which, as I said before, they're not inclined to oppose.
But what about entitlements? Is that something that you think that they really do think is politically viable? It's one thing to say get rid of Social Security and Medicare, but it's another thing to make that.
Yeah, I think there are some Tea Partiers, maybe sort of the types like Kelly Carrender, who are very idealistic about this, sort of the younger Tea Partiers. But there's, in the poll that the Times did in April, we found that 50% or more of Tea Party supporters were on Social Security or Medicare or lived with someone who did, and they like those programs. So again, they're like other Americans in this regard. They don't want to get rid of those programs. They enjoy them.
Jamal?
Katie, yeah, I think going after Social Security and entitlements is sort of a popular campaign rhetoric, but even Republicans are sort of distancing themselves from how much they want to go against that right now. But Rich talks about the deficit and the debt being one of the big problems, which a lot of us are very concerned about, Democrats and Republicans. But at the same time, the other problem people are concerned about is competitiveness. And so if you talk about cutting the budget back to 2008 levels, that's a 21% cut you're going to have to make in education funding out of the federal government. And I'm not sure how that helps us deal with the competitiveness problem. So there's a place where the rubber meets the road here that I'm not sure these candidates are prepared right now to really deal with.
But somebody's going to have to make some tough choices, Jamal, and who's that going to be?
Somebody is going to have to make tough choices, and one of those tough choices is not giving a tax cut to millionaires, people who make more than $250,000 a year, which is going to cause us to have to borrow $700 billion from the Chinese or the Saudis or somebody else in the world.
Hasn't President Obama shown some wiggle room on that, Jamal, like raising that threshold to either $500,000 or even $1 million, so that the tax cuts can end for the wealthiest Americans, but not for people, say, from $250,000 to $500,000 a year?
I think the concern is probably about small business owners and making sure that people don't get caught in this net who shouldn't be. And so there's a little bit of negotiating room here. But that's what happens when you come to Washington. You have to negotiate with people who you don't necessarily agree with to try to reach a result that's mostly in line with your principles. I'm not convinced these Tea Party candidates are prepared for that level of negotiation.
Well, I'm not sure the president, Jamal, to be frank, was a model of compromise either. His famous line to House Republicans when he was meeting them was, "I won the election, so I'm going to have my way." And I think part of what we're seeing in the country is a reaction to the high-handedness and arrogance. I mean, the health care bill, it was clear there was no bipartisan consensus for that. It was unpopular in the country persistently before it passed, while it passed, after it passed, even now. And he just did what he wanted to do because he has the majorities to jam it through. So I don't think you should be lecturing Tea Partiers on the need to compromise when the president didn't do it either.
But weren't there many times, though, Rich? And again, it's so hard. It's confusing for the average person because you read on one hand and then on the other hand. But didn't the president try to negotiate and try to compromise with the Republicans on certain instances as well? And they were basically told, remember there's the famous story of President Obama saying he went to a meeting and he heard heard before he even got there that Republicans weren't going to even entertain any of his ideas?
Look, the way I look at this, he could have had half a loaf on everything, and there still would have been Tea Party type ferment. But you wouldn't have seen the scale of reaction you have seen if you did a stimulus that was half as big, if you did a half a loaf on health care. Instead, and this is an understandable calculation, instead he figured, I have historic majorities in the House and the Senate. I have a year to jam this thing through. Now, I'd argue, I don't think he had a mandate for it, because he never mentioned that he was going to spend.
That's what he might have thought.
Well, he never mentioned he was going to spend $100 billion in deficit spending, $800 billion. And if he had mentioned that during the campaign, it would have been a big deal. Remember, in the campaign, he opposed the individual mandate, which is the key part of his health care legislation. So he just figured, I can do this stuff, therefore I'm going to do it.
But you blame.
I'm sorry.
Jamal's going to interrupt. Hold on 2 seconds, because I want to talk to you, Kate, about the funding of the Tea Party movement, and then you can add to what Jamal says. Go ahead, Jamal.
I'm just not sure we ought to rewrite history here. I'll be very quick. I think, people on the left were very upset because the president held out for so long in the summer trying to find Republicans who would come on board the plan. And in fact, he even had a meeting with Republicans and said, if I agree to what you're asking, will you then vote for the plan? And the answer to that question was, well, I can't tell you that I will. How do you negotiate in that kind of situation with someone? So,
wasn't that
this idea that the president...
I don't remember who it was. It was clear, though, Jamal, he got the left most plausible health care plan he could get through Congress.
But he tried.
He dropped the public option.
He
well, he wanted a patina of 1 or 2 Republicans, but was he going to sit down with Mitch McConnell and saying, what can I do to do a consensus plan that gets 75 votes in the Senate? Of course not, because he thought he had a historic opportunity to jam this stuff through.
Go ahead, Jamal.
I think they did that a lot. And then when you talk about what happened, with the stimulus plan, that's $800 billion plan, that really the president put tax cuts in that plan, but the Republicans, because they didn't propose it, they didn't go along with it. He tried to do a deficit commission, and even the person who sponsored the deficit commission in the House or in the Senate voted against the deficit commission when it came up for a vote. This Republican majority decided it was in their political interest to oppose this president every single time he proposed something.
It all passed. Why? These are powerless Republicans. They are a rump minority. Yes, they oppose this stuff. I would argue on principle.
But now you can't complain that he was not being bipartisan.
It all passed. What I'm saying is that he realized he could pass it, and he therefore decided to jam it through with very little or no Republican support, and now he's reaping the whirlwind. It just seems undeniable.
But you can't complain that he didn't have Republican support when he went after Republican support and Republicans said no.
If he had scaled back in some serious way, he could have gotten Republican support. But he was not interested.
I'm not convinced that's true.
Jamal, look, if you're a liberal Democrat and you have 60 votes in the Senate, a huge 75 vote margin in the House, and for decades you've been trying to get a major health care reform through. Are you really going to compromise, to get half the Republican caucus, or are you going to take the maximalist plan you can get? That you can get with Democrats. Clearly, you're going to take the maximalist option. That's what he did.
But that was a public option, so
the maximalist.
Right, exactly. If he could have gotten it, he would, but he couldn't get enough Democrats.
Government paid for it. Okay, Rich.
He couldn't. Democrats flaked.
This is why people really don't know, who wouldn't compromise with whom. Let me ask you, Kate. Getting back to the Tea Party, there was Jane Mayer wrote an interesting piece in the New Yorker about the Koch brothers, and the question is, it may have started as a grassroots movement, but there's a school of thought out there that's being financed by these very, very wealthy corporate fat cats like the Koch brothers who really want to protect their multi-billion-dollar oil and gas business, and they see anti-regulation and smaller government as being conducive to their business interests. So where is this money coming from the Tea Party, and what did you find in that arena?
Well, I think originally it does genuinely start out as a grassroots movement. It doesn't take a lot of money to start a Tea Party. You need some people who are angry, you need some signs, you need, call your local conservative radio host, have them put out the word for you. So I don't think it took a lot of money to start this movement. But I do think that that very quickly a lot of groups like Freedom Works, like the Koch brothers, which they operate a group called, or they fund a group called
Americans for Prosperity. Exactly. Right. And Freedom Works is Dick Armey's organization.
Exactly. Right. They did move very quickly, particularly Freedom Works, to organize the Tea Parties. They put up websites instantly saying, here's what to write in your signs. Here's how to start a Tea Party in your town, and to go to your neighbor's town and start a town. Go to your friends and start a Tea Party with them. But look, I think the movement has And particularly now as we move toward the general election, Americans for Prosperity is setting up get-out-the-vote centers with Tea Party groups across the country.
And they financed a lot of these candidates, haven't they?
Exactly. They finance. They give money to Senator Jim DeMint's Senate Conservatives Fund. They've given money to other candidates. And Americans for Prosperity is certainly doing a lot of get-out-the-vote. I don't think it started that way. And frankly, a lot of these groups like Freedom Works and Americans for Prosperity had been trying to grow a grassroots movement for a number of years. And they couldn't do it because they didn't have this groundswell of support. I think the key factor was the cratering of the economy, and that's really what brought people out. But to me, the proof that this was not AstroTurf is Christine O'Donnell's election, because all these, quote-unquote AstroTurf groups didn't want Christine O'Donnell to win in Delaware because they knew she couldn't win. It was the grassroots Tea Party groups who were sort of out there hoping against hope that she could and mobilizing for her to win.
As you know, Rich, the Obama administration has made a big deal out of the United Citizens
right.
United versus the FEC and what happened with that Supreme Court decision, kind of unleashing unlimited funds, undisclosed funds to these various candidates. Do you think they have a point? Something tells me you're going to say no. but well, what about this whole argument?
Sure. I'm of mixed mind on the question of disclosure. I think certainly if you give money directly to a candidate, the candidate should have to disclose the sources of his funding. But some of the things that have happened around Proposition 8, where people contributed to the proposition, were harassed or intimidated or even in some cases fired, makes me wonder whether the person who's just engaging in political advocacy as a general matter should have to disclose or not.
But what about these big corporations, for example, that have an agenda that maybe big oil companies or,
sure.
that the American people only see that they're supporting a particular candidate, but they don't see where the money for that support is coming from and how that candidate, if elected, may be beholden to that organization.
Well, I mean, the First Amendment says if you're a big oil company, you have a right to defend your interests and to advocate just like anyone else.
Right,
and,
but do you
as
think
a general
they should
matter,
disclose it?
As I say, I'm mixed on that. As a general matter, I like spending in elections. The more spending, the better. Because what do people spend money on? It's to communicate a message.
Negative campaign ads,
sure,
are those good?
Yeah, but look at the top 5 groups that have spent in this election, outside groups. 3 of them are unions. Okay, so it's and there was a lot of outside spending to elect Barack Obama in 2008. I didn't complain about that or say there's something wrong. Well, I might have complained about it. I didn't say there's anything wrong about it. You want people to be engaged. This is a big monumental election. There are big questions in this country to be decided. Let's have everyone mixing it up.
And Jamal, what is the difference between like unions, big unions, or AFSCME or various organizations pouring money into Barack Obama's campaign versus what we're seeing today?
Well, we know where that money came from. It came from union dues. It came from union members, people who, donated their money every week in their paycheck to their union.
And those names are public, right?
The union's names are public,
yeah.
And you can go find out who the members are. And if you're donating to a campaign, that campaign is obligated to report everyone who's given its money. The question here is about disclosure. And even if someone is going to be get harassed because they gave money or have to face some sort of public response to that, that's part of the debate. I mean, if you speak out and you want to use your First Amendment rights, you don't get to have your First Amendment only as you can say it in private. You get to have your First Amendment to speak up in public and say your beliefs. And if you have a repercussion from that, then you have a repercussion. But we've got to have a situation where people have the opportunity to go out and know who is funding these campaigns and not have some anonymous Russian oligarch-style billionaires sitting behind a cloaked room working the strings like puppet masters.
Well, what's the difference between that Russian and maybe somebody like George Soros? I'm just curious. George Soros has always been funding these Democratic campaigns. Now, Jane Mayer made the argument that those political decisions aren't going to benefit his business necessarily. But how is somebody like George Soros different than somebody like David Koch?
He's not. How do we know that George Soros donated the money? We know it because it was disclosed, because people found out about it. That's the question. Not whether or not they give the money. The question is whether or not we know that they gave the money.
Doesn't he have a point?
Well, yeah. I mean, maybe. But this is not what this election is about. Lincoln said, without public sentiment, nothing has as possible. With it, everything is possible. And this goes to the point that Kate was just making. You can have these conservative groups, in their evil lair, trying to plan a grassroots movement and pouring billions of dollars in it. And it's not going to happen unless there's the spark of a genuine grassroots movement. And the Kochs have been involved in funding conservative organizations literally for decades.
I think their father was a big John Birch guy, right?
You look at 06, and Republicans told themselves, we have the money advantage. Our incumbent office holders are outraising all the Democrats. It didn't make a difference because the country was sick and tired of the Republicans, and it wanted to move. And it's the same thing this time around, except for they're sick and tired of the Democrats, and they're going to move. It doesn't matter about the spending.
But my question about the Kochs is they go to such lengths.
Wait, Jamal, hold on 2 seconds.
My question about the Kochs is they go to such lengths to be secretive. They have these meetings twice a year in Aspen, and now they're planning one in Palm Springs for January. And it's, don't tweet about this, don't put it on your Facebook page, don't tell anyone, don't call the hotel to make a reservation. We don't want anyone to know you're here. I mean, why so secretive if it's just the open political debate?
Some people like attention, others don't. And I mean, the fact is, how secret can it be if we're reading long articles about it in the New Yorker and the New York Times? And this is the other thing, Katie. I mean, ask me, ultimately where the money is coming from. It's mandatory union dues from union members who support a liberal agenda. Chamber of Commerce, it's a pretty good bet. It's businesses who oppose big government who are giving this money. It's not really a mystery. And the deep reason why we're having this debate over money is Democrats don't really have anything else to hang their hat on this year. They can't talk about health care. Democrats around the country are running away from it. They can't even use the word stimulus because it's such an embarrassment and obvious failure. So then the White House had to gin up this bogus charge about secret money and foreign money, especially bogus, influencing the election, which is just a flat-out smear.
Jamal, those are fighting words. Go ahead, have at
it. Well, Rich said a second ago that the country's tired of Democrats. Well, it actually turns out the country's tired of Republicans, too. And in fact, Democrats tend to perform better in terms of, who do you agree with or who do you think has policies that are like you. Democrats do well. President Obama does better than Republicans in Congress. Democrats in Congress do better than Republicans in Congress. The question, though, is people are mad at incumbents and people are mad at the system. And on this, I will give Sarah Palin some credit. I think that they bought into the hopey, changey thing from 2008, and the president got here, and the Republicans refused to play ball, and for a variety of reasons, the hopey, changey thing in their minds maybe didn't work out. So now they're a little more angry and maybe even a little bit more anxious about their futures. And so they want somebody in Washington to do something. And if it requires them to turn over the apple cart, that's what they'll do. But they want somebody to focus on the problems. And Republicans will be in the worst shape possible if they win enough seats in this election to have some control, and then they still don't do anything to help fix the problems in the country. I think the price you pay for that in 2012 will be greater than anything you've seen.
But Jamal, if the big beef is too much government, is being an obstructionist and keeping the government from growing even bigger actually doing something, even though it may appear to be doing nothing?
I'm not convinced that's really the big beef. I think what people want is that they want the government to do something that they can feel in their lives. The problem with the health care plan is that the big benefits just started kicking in on September 23rd. So you don't actually have people who are reaping the benefits from health care until right now. By next year from now, you'll have 25-year-olds who've been able to stay on their parents' health care, and they can go out and they can talk about that. You'll have a mother whose child had a pre-existing condition who can go out and say, I was able to get health care last year when I wasn't able to get it 2 years ago because of President Obama. At that point, I think Americans may be a little bit happier with the health care plan than they are today.
Can I just ask Kate one more question about the Tea Party? We see surveys, and it seems that most of them are older white males. Right. Is that what you found in the course of your research?
No, what was interesting, I mean, polls back that up, but when you look at who's organizing the Tea Party, particularly who started it, it was actually people who were, 30s, in their 20s and 30s. And a lot of the people who are organizing the Tea Party are women, and often young suburban mothers, who talk about this sort of as a national security issue for them. And for instance, there's this call every Monday night by a group called Tea Party Patriots, and about more than half of the people on that call are women. They are the organizers. But I do think the people who have come out to the rallies, the people who have come out and sort of brought this raw frustration to the rallies, do tend to be, by and large, male and older.
And is there a racist element? Of course, that's been a point of conversation and discussion for many months now, given the fact that some of the signs are pretty objectionable, or can be, at Tea Party rallies. I mean, they will argue it's just a few bad apples, and that happens with any organization. But did you sense any kind of undercurrent racist attitudes among them?
Well, I've certainly seen the signs, and I think that the sort of hardcore Tea Partiers will argue, well, those signs are brought to the rallies by Democrats who are trying to make us look bad, and that to me just seems completely implausible. So I do think that element exists. I think there's a difference, though, between saying that there is a racist element to the Tea Party and saying that the Tea Party is motivated by race. I don't think the Tea Party is motivated by race. I think it's motivated by genuine concern about government intrusion or the debt and spending. I don't think I don't think the fact that we had a black president in the White House was the motivating factor for the Tea Party.
What's your sense of that, Jamal?
I think in general, Kate's probably right, that for most people who associate themselves with the Tea Party, they're there because of some ideological belief. However, there are clearly enough people who are there who feel uncomfortable with the president being there because of who he is and maybe what he looks like. It's amazing how similar some of those signs are that are at Tea Party rallies that were similar to the signs from 2008 when John McCain was running for president, and we saw him even have to stand up and sort of tamp down the crowd because things were getting a little out of control. So I don't think all Tea Partiers are bad people or even motivated by race. And in fact, I've said to liberal audiences over and over again, don't be mad at the Tea Party because they're doing what they're constitutionally protected to do, which is to go out and advocate for what they believe. The question is, will people on the progressive side get up and make sure their representatives know in a forceful way, even after an election, that they still have some ideas they think that those representatives should pursue?
And Rich, Jonathan asks, we solicited some questions on Twitter and Facebook, and Jonathan asks, is the Tea Party movement a fad? I think wasn't that what Jimmy Carter said?
Yeah.
I think when he was interviewed a couple of months ago, that he didn't think they would be around for a while. It seems to me they're much more than a fad.
Yeah, I think it'll be an enduring movement because, I mean, this debate we're having over the size of government, it's been a 30-year struggle, and it may be another 30 years, so we should all dig in and get used to it. So I doubt they're going to go away. The question is whether they will be as engaged, a year and a half from now, after they've suffered some disappointments, when they've seen Republicans they can repeal the health care bill in the House, but it's going to die in the Senate. They can pass a budget that's pretty austere on the domestic discretionary stuff, but as we just discussed earlier, probably is going to die in the Senate. Are they going to throw up in their hands, or are they going to realize that you need a Senate and you need a president really to get this stuff done?
And Kate, Sylvia LaFrance asks a simple question on Facebook: why Sarah Palin? To whom does she appeal and why?
Well, it's interesting, the Sarah Palin question, because a lot of people think that she's the Tea Party leader. But when you talk to Tea Party supporters, which we did in our poll, they actually are just like other Americans in this regard. They don't think she's qualified to be president. They like her. They think she's entertaining. She gives a speech and they all go. But they don't necessarily want her in the White House or think she's qualified to be president.
I was surprised she has a 22% approval rating among registered voters. I thought it was higher, but it's not. No, I mean, I'm just surprised because that's very, very low. And even among Tea Party supporters, when asked if she should run for president, most of them, the majority, is that right, say no?
Yeah. And I think they think that she's been good to rally people to their cause, but they don't necessarily want her to. They don't think she's going to stand up well in debates against Obama. They don't necessarily think she has a broad repertoire. They think she's sort of one note, going against what Jamal was saying, the hopey-changey thing. How's that hopey-changey thing working out for you? They don't think that she's sort of shown herself since 2008 to be a candidate who has a lot of range, which you obviously need when you're.
And who do you look at when you think, Rich, about 2012? Who sort of excites you or appeals to you? I'm sorry, it probably gives you indigestion that I'm even asking you, but it's not that far away.
I know. It's the Iowa straw poll is like 10 months away or so, and that'll winnow the field, by half. So it's as wide open as a Republican field has ever been. And this is Bill Clinton's line about how presidential primary politics works is really right. He says Democrats want to fall in love, Republicans want to fall in line. And you really saw that with the Democrats. They had the establishment front runner with Hillary Clinton, but they fell in love with someone else. You saw it on the Republican side with John McCain. His campaign imploded. He was left for dead. There were so many better options, or at least one, I thought at the time, Mitt Romney, but they fell in line because he was the next guy. This is going to be a Republican field where you don't really have a next guy. Mitt Romney's going to try to be it. Sarah Palin, if she gets in, and I wouldn't be surprised if she does, is going to be, at least for a time, I think the weirdest thing ever in Republican politics, which is the anti-establishment frontrunner. She'll probably be ahead in the polls where you have people in Washington pulling their hair out over this, but she'll be treated as a rock star in Iowa. So that's a long way of saying, Katie, I have no idea.
And Jamal, what about, before we go, I wanted to ask you about the whole sort of the speculation that if the House goes Republican and even the Senate, that this would be a good thing for President Obama because it would echo 1994, where he had kind of Newt Gingrich to use as a foil. What do you think about that sort of point of view? And what if it's just the House and not the Senate? What happens then?
Well, Katie, I'm one of the few people left in Washington who think that it's not guaranteed the House is going to go Republican. I think if there's a hurricane brewing, the Democrats have been building seawalls for the last few months to try to protect enough members to keep the majority. That may actually work. So we'll see. We can get to that. But I think even if they were lucky enough to get one of those houses, I think the Republicans are going to be much more recalcitrant. I think you've got people like Darrell Issa in the House who runs the House Government Oversight Committee, that he wants to run investigations into the administration. So the administration's got to sort of position against that. I don't think that the White House wants to have to deal with that if they don't have to. I was in the Clinton administration in 1995 and 96 when the Republicans first got in charge, and it was brutal. I mean, we spent a lot of time answering questions from committees and not a lot of time governing. So it'll be a tough row. But
it was a good thing ultimately for President Clinton, wasn't it?
Well, you know, the benefit of a good politician is you adapt to whatever circumstance you're in. So if you're in a bad circumstance, you figure out how to get out of it. But nobody wants to be in a bad circumstance. I think the president will figure out a way to be successful. He can use the Republicans as a foil. But it also is better if you really want to get things done on energy and not have big tax cuts and really sort of try to deal with the deficit. I think the president would rather have two congressional majorities that he can deal with.
Well, Jamal Simmons, Rich Lowry, and Kate Zernike, thank you, guys. It was really fun.
Much.
I mean, I could talk about this for several hours more.
So could we.
Probably could too. But look forward to maybe we can talk after the midterms and see how everything shook out. It'll be a very, very interesting night. All right, thanks, everybody. And thanks for watching, by the way, and sending in your questions. Remember, you can follow me on Twitter. Do you guys follow me on Twitter?
Absolutely.
You do?
I do.
How about you, Rich?
I'll have to
He will.
check.
You better. Otherwise, we're going to have to edit you out of this show. My handle is @Katie Couric, and you can see all the episodes of this web show anytime. Just go to cbsnews.com. And now stay tuned for a message from our sponsor, Duff.